These bullies don't realize that their opponent is a karate master. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Seojin High, casting long shadows across the polished hallway floors. Students rushed past in their crisp uniforms, their voices echoing off the walls in a symphony of teenage chatter and laughter. But in the midst of all this energy, one figure moved differently. Hana Kim walked with her head slightly bowed, her dark hair falling like a curtain across her face, her footsteps almost silent against the marble floor. She carried her books close to her chest, as if they were a shield protecting her from the world around her. Maybe you've been there before, that feeling of wanting to disappear, to become invisible in a crowd of people who seem to have it all figured out. Hana knew that feeling intimately. Every morning, she would slip through the school entrance, hoping to make it to her classroom unnoticed, hoping that today would be different, that today she could just exist in peace. But peace was a luxury that Seojin High didn't offer to students like Hana. The hierarchy at this school was as rigid as ancient stone. At the top sat Minji Park, a girl whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. Her perfectly styled hair caught the light as she moved through the hallways like a queen surveying her kingdom. Behind her followed her court, Yuna, whose laugh was as sharp as broken glass, and Sora, whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had learned that power came from making others feel small. Hana had learned to read the signs, the way conversations would suddenly stop when she passed, the way groups would part, not out of respect, but to create a clear path for what was about to unfold. She could feel their eyes on her now, tracking her movement like predators watching prey. Well, well, Minji's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Look who decided to grace us with her presence. The hallway began to slow, students sensing the shift in atmosphere, the way animals sense an approaching storm. Some stopped pretending to look at their phones. Others lingered by their lockers, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. This was entertainment for them, a daily show that broke up the monotony of academic life. Hana's grip tightened on her books, but she didn't lift her eyes. She had learned that eye contact was seen as a challenge, and challenges led to escalation. She tried to step around the group, her movement fluid and controlled in a way that most people wouldn't notice, but Minji stepped into her path with practiced precision. Where do you think you're going? Yuna's voice joined in, creating a harmony of mockery. Don't you have something to say to us? The circle was forming now, that invisible but unmistakable barrier that separated victim from spectator. Students pressed against lockers and walls, creating an arena where humiliation would play out under the bright fluorescent lights. Some pulled out their phones, ready to capture whatever was about to unfold, ready to turn someone's pain into content for their social media feeds. But what none of them could see was the way Hana's breathing had shifted, becoming deeper and more controlled. They couldn't see how her feet had naturally found their balance, how her center of gravity had lowered almost imperceptibly. These were habits ingrained by years of training, reflexes that activated even when her mind was focused on de-escalation. In her mind, she could hear her grandfather's voice, calm and steady, like flowing water over stones. Strength without restraint is destruction, Hanaya. True power lies not in the ability to fight, but in the wisdom to choose when fighting is necessary. Grandfather. The thought of him brought a warmth to her chest that contrasted sharply with the cold hostility surrounding her. Every morning before school, she would find him in their small garden, moving through his kata with the grace of someone who had spent 70 years perfecting his art. His movements were poetry written in the air, each technique flowing into the next with the inevitability of seasons changing. Your grandmother was like you, he had told her once, after a particularly difficult day at school. Quiet, thoughtful, always seeking peace, but when someone threatened what she loved, she became a storm that could level mountains. The choice was always hers, when to be the gentle rain and when to be the hurricane. Standing there in the hallway, surrounded by the hungry eyes of her classmates and the predatory smiles of her tormentors, Hana made the choice she made every day. She would be the gentle rain. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want any trouble." The words seemed to energize Minji like blood in the water energizes a shark. Her smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth that somehow managed to look more threatening than comforting. "You don't want any trouble," Minji repeated, her voice pitched just loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "But trouble seems to follow you everywhere, doesn't it, Hana? Like a bad smell that won't go away." Laughter rippled through the crowd, not the genuine laughter of joy, but the hollow laughter of people grateful they weren't the target. Hana had heard this laughter before, had felt its sting, but she had also learned to let it flow around her like water around a stone. She tried again to move past the group, but Sora stepped forward this time, her movement deliberate and theatrical. "Where are your friends, Hana?" "Oh, wait." She looked around with exaggerated confusion. "You don't have any, do you?" The comment hit its mark, but not in the way Sora intended. For Hana, friendships had always been complicated. How do you explain to someone that you spend your afternoons in a dojo instead of at cafes? How do you tell them that your grandfather has taught you things that would change how they see you forever? How do you maintain relationships when you're constantly choosing silence over self-defense? But what her classmates saw as isolation, Hana knew was actually protection. Protection for them, and protection for the peace she worked so hard to maintain. The crowd pressed closer now, sensing that something bigger was building. Phone cameras focused, ready to capture what they assumed would be another routine humiliation. But if they had looked more carefully, if they had studied Hana's posture instead of just waiting for her to break, they might have noticed something that would have given them pause. Despite everything, despite the mockery, despite the isolation, despite the daily gauntlet of cruelty, Hana Kim stood with the quiet dignity of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Her head might have been bowed, but her spine was straight. Her voice might have been soft, but her breathing was controlled. Her eyes might have been downcast, but her feet were planted with the stability of ancient trees. Because here's what nobody at Seojin High understood. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is quiet because they're the only one who truly understands the weight of their own power. Have you ever felt like Hana? Have you ever had to choose between showing who you really are and keeping the peace? Because what's about to happen next will change everything, not just for Hana, but for everyone who's ever felt like they had to hide their true strength from a world that mistakes kindness for weakness. The morning light continued to stream through those tall windows, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The predators were circling, the audience was ready, and the girl they all thought they knew was about to show them exactly who they'd been underestimating all along. But that moment, that earth-shattering, perspective-changing moment, was still building, still gathering force like a wave, preparing to break against the shore. The tension in the hallway had reached that critical point where something had to give. It was like watching a rope being stretched tighter and tighter, everyone waiting for the inevitable snap that would change everything. Minji sensed it too. That delicious moment when she held absolute power over someone's dignity, when she could choose to be merciful or to deliver the killing blow that would make this humiliation legendary. She chose destruction. "You know what I heard, Hana?" Minji's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried perfectly through the silent hallway. "I heard that your family can't even afford to live in a real house. I heard you live in some tiny apartment above your grandfather's old karate school, if you can even call that pathetic place a school." The words hit Hana like physical blows, each syllable designed to cut deeper than the last. She felt her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, her breathing shift from the controlled rhythm of meditation to something more primal. Because Minji had just crossed a line that shouldn't exist, she had brought family into this. The dojo wasn't just where Hana lived, it was sacred ground. It was where her grandfather had spent decades teaching not just techniques, but philosophy. It was where her grandmother's picture hung on the wall, watching over every training session with gentle eyes. It was where Hana had learned that martial arts wasn't about fighting. It was about understanding yourself so completely that you never had to prove anything to anyone. But Minji wasn't finished. She never was when she sensed she'd found a weak spot. I bet your grandfather fills your head with all those ancient stories about honor and respect, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she fed off the crowd's energy. But look around, Hana. This isn't some old movie. This is the real world where being honorable just makes you everyone's doormat. Yuna stepped closer, emboldened by Minji's lead. Maybe that's why your parents left you with him. Maybe they got tired of pretending to be proud of such a disappointment. The lie was so outrageous, so far from the truth, that for a moment Hana almost laughed. Her parents hadn't left her. They had died in a car accident when she was 8 years old, and her grandfather had become not just her guardian, but her anchor in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unstable. He had taught her to find strength in stillness, power in peace, confidence in silence. But the crowd didn't know that. All they saw was Hana Kim, the girl who never fought back, the girl who absorbed every insult like she deserved it. And in their silence, in their eager anticipation of her humiliation, they became complicit in something far crueler than they realized. Look at her, Sora joined in, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. She can't even defend herself. What kind of person just stands there and takes it? What kind of person indeed? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. But if they had really looked at Hana in that moment, they would have seen something that should have made them step back. They would have seen the way her stance had shifted, subtle but significant. They would have noticed how her breathing had deepened, how her center of gravity had lowered, how every muscle in her body was now coiled with potential energy. Most importantly, they would have seen that for the first time since this confrontation began, Hana Kim had lifted her eyes. And in those eyes was something that had been hidden for too long, a fire that burned not with anger, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally been pushed past their carefully maintained boundaries. "My grandfather," Hana said, her voice still quiet but carrying a new quality that made several students in the back of the crowd shift uncomfortably. "It taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away." She took a step toward the edge of the circle, but Minji moved to block her path, the predator in her sensing that her prey was trying to escape before the kill was complete. "Oh no," Minji said, her smile widening into something that would have looked more appropriate on a shark. "You don't get to walk away from me. Not when I'm talking to you." And then she did something that changed everything, something that crossed the final line that shouldn't have been crossed. With the calculated cruelty of someone who had perfected the art of humiliation, Minji reached out and shoved Hana backward, hard enough to make her stumble, hard enough to make the crowd gasp, hard enough to turn verbal assault into physical violence. But here's what Minji didn't know, what none of them knew, about the girl they had been tormenting. Hana Kim didn't stumble because she was weak or caught off guard. She stumbled because in that split second, she made a choice to absorb the impact rather than respond with the lightning-fast reflexes that would have automatically countered the attack. Even as she fought to maintain her balance, even as the crowd erupted in excited murmurs at this escalation, Hana was still choosing peace over power. She was still trying to de-escalate, still hoping that this could end without anyone getting hurt. But some choices get taken away from you. "What's wrong with you?" Minji's voice was louder now, emboldened by what she saw as victory. "Are you too pathetic to even stand up straight? Maybe you need another push to help you find your balance." She raised her hand again, and this time the threat was unmistakable. This time, everyone in that hallway knew that what had been psychological torture was about to become something far worse. The phones that had been recording gleefully suddenly felt heavier in their owner's hands as they realized they were about to capture something that might cross legal lines. But here's the thing about people who have trained their entire lives to read situations, to understand violence before it happens, to see 3 moves ahead of any physical confrontation. They know exactly when the tipping point has been reached. And as Minji's hand began its descent toward Hana's face, as the crowd held its collective breath, as phone cameras focused on what they thought would be the final humiliation of the quiet girl from the dojo, that's when everything changed. Because what happened next wasn't just about one girl defending herself. It wasn't just about a bully finally meeting someone she couldn't break. It was about the moment when hidden strength reveals itself, when quiet dignity transforms into undeniable power, when everyone discovers that the person they thought they knew was actually someone completely different. Have you ever had that moment? That instant when you realized you'd been completely wrong about someone? When the person you thought was weak turned out to be the strongest one in the room, because what's about to happen in that hallway at Seojin High will redefine everything these students thought they knew about strength, about weakness, about the quiet girl who always walked with her head down. The hand was falling, the crowd was watching, and Hana Kim was about to show them exactly who they'd been underestimating all along. Time seemed to slow in that hallway, the way it does in moments when everything is about to change forever. Minji's hand descended toward Hana's face with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged, never been stopped, never been shown that actions have consequences. The crowd pressed closer, their phones raised, their breathing shallow with anticipation. And then something impossible happened. Hana's hand moved. Not with the desperate flailing of someone trying to protect themselves, not with the awkward panic of an amateur, but with the fluid precision of water finding its path around stone. Her movement was so fast, so controlled, so perfectly executed that for a moment nobody understood what they had just witnessed. Minji's slap never landed. Instead, her wrist was caught in Hana's grip with such gentle firmness that it looked almost like a dance move, like choreographed poetry in motion. The hallway fell into a silence so complete that the sound of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead seemed deafening. "What?" Minji's voice trailed off as she stared at her captured hand, unable to process what had just happened. She pulled against Hana's grip, expecting to break free easily, expecting to reassert her dominance through sheer force. But Hana's grip was like trying to break free from flowing water, soft enough not to hurt, strong enough to be absolutely unmovable. For exactly 3 seconds, the entire social order of Seojin High hung in the balance. For 3 seconds, everyone in that hallway glimpsed a reality where Hana Kim wasn't the victim, where she possessed capabilities that none of them had even suspected. And then Hana made the choice that would haunt her for weeks to come. She let go. "I'm sorry," she whispered, releasing Minji's wrist and immediately stepping back, her eyes dropping to the floor once again. "I didn't mean to. The spell was broken. The moment of possibility collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane." Minji jerked her hand back, rubbing her wrist where Hana's fingers had held her, but more importantly, rubbing away the memory of helplessness that had just flooded through her system. "You..." Minji's voice shook with rage and something else, something that might have been fear if she had been capable of admitting such a thing. "You think you can put your hands on me?" The crowd exhaled collectively, and in that breath was relief, disappointment, and renewed hunger for drama. Because they had seen something extraordinary for just a moment, but now the natural order was reasserting itself. The quiet girl was apologizing again, submitting again, returning to her role as victim. But some of them had seen. Some of them had witnessed that impossible moment of grace and control. And they couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to Hana Kim than met the eye. "Did you see how fast she moved?" Someone whispered in the back of the crowd. "That was weird, right? Like really weird. Maybe she does karate or something?" But these whispers were quickly drowned out by Minji's renewed assault. her voice carrying over the murmurs like a siren cutting through fog. "Nobody touches me," she declared, her tone making it clear that this was about much more than a blocked slap. This was about power, about hierarchy, about the fundamental order of their world. Nobody. And then she did something that sent shockwaves through the watching students. She reached out and shoved Hana again, harder this time, putting her full weight behind it, sending the smaller girl stumbling backward until she hit the lockers with a metallic crash that echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. The impact drove the air from Hana's lungs, but even as she fought to catch her breath, even as pain bloomed across her back where she'd hit the metal, she didn't retaliate. She pressed her palms against the lockers behind her and slowly pushed herself upright, her movements careful and controlled, despite the pain. "Fight back," someone called out from the crowd, though whether it was encouragement or mockery was impossible to tell. "Yeah, let's see that karate stuff again," another voice added, and now there was definitely an edge of cruelty to it. Because that's what crowds do, isn't it? They smell blood in the water, and they circle like sharks, not caring which swimmer gets eaten as long as they get to watch. They had seen a glimpse of something extraordinary, and now they wanted to see it again, but this time they wanted to see it crushed. Minji sensed the shift in the crowd's energy and fed off it like a vampire feeding off life force. She stepped closer to Hana, close enough that her voice would carry to every phone camera, close enough that there would be no mistaking her dominance. "You know what your problem is, Hana," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "You think you're special. You think you're different from the rest of us. But you're not. You're just a scared little girl playing dress-up in her grandfather's fantasy world." Each word was calculated to cut deeper, to strip away another layer of dignity, to reduce Hana to nothing more than the sum of her apparent weaknesses. And the terrible thing was, it was working. Not because Hana believed the words, but because she was starting to realize that her choices were becoming more limited by the second. She could feel it building inside her, not anger exactly, but something more dangerous. A kind of crystalline clarity that came from years of training, years of learning to read situations and opponents, years of understanding that sometimes peaceful resolution simply isn't possible. Her grandfather's voice whispered in her memory, "The warrior's greatest victory is the battle that never happens." But when that battle becomes inevitable, the warrior must be prepared to win decisively and with honor. Was this that moment? Had they finally reached the point where walking away was no longer an option? Hana lifted her eyes again, and this time she let them meet Minji's gaze directly. What Minji saw there should have made her pause, should have made her reconsider, should have made her understand that she was standing at the edge of a cliff she didn't even know existed. But Minji had never learned to read the subtle signs of true danger. She had built her power on intimidating people who would never fight back, never challenge her, never show her the consequences of her actions. She mistook Hana's previous restraint for inability, her choice for weakness, her mercy for surrender. "There she is," Minji said with satisfaction, as if Hana's direct gaze was some kind of admission of defeat. "Finally showing your true face, and you know what I see? Nothing, absolutely nothing." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something bigger was building, that the main event was about to begin. Phones focused, fingers hovered over social media apps, and everyone held their breath waiting for what would happen next. But here's what none of them understood about the girl standing against those lockers, with her back straight and her eyes clear. Hana Kim had just made a decision that would change everything. Not just for her, not just for this moment, but for everyone who had ever confused kindness with weakness, peace with powerlessness. The storm was finally ready to break, and when it did, it would wash away every assumption they'd ever made about the quiet girl from the dojo. Because sometimes, the gentlest rain is just the calm before the hurricane. And hurricanes, well, hurricanes reshape the entire landscape. What was about to happen next would be talked about at Seojin High for years to come, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The moment arrived without fanfare, without dramatic music, without any of the theatrical elements you might expect from such a life-changing instant. It came quietly, the way truly powerful moments often do, like the split second when an earthquake begins, before the ground starts shaking, when the only sign of what's coming is a subtle shift that most people never notice. Minji raised her hand again, but this time there was something different in her movement. This time, there was genuine malice, the kind of focused cruelty that comes from someone who has been challenged and needs to reassert their dominance through overwhelming force. Her fingers were slightly curved, her intention clear. This wasn't going to be just a slap, this was going to leave marks. "Let me show you what happens to freaks who think they can embarrass me," she hissed. And in those words was the promise of real violence, the kind that crosses legal lines and leaves lasting damage. And that's when Hana Kim finally stopped choosing peace. Not because she wanted to fight, not because she was angry or seeking revenge, but because she realized, with the crystal-clear perception of someone trained to read violence before it happens, that Minji wasn't going to stop, that this wasn't going to end with humiliation. It was going to end with injury, real physical harm that could affect her ability to train, to honor her grandfather's teachings, to fulfill the promise she had made to her grandmother's memory. The hand came down fast, driven by years of bullying smaller kids, of never facing consequences, of believing that power came from the ability to hurt others without repercussion. But Hana's response wasn't fast. It was inevitable. Her movement flowed like water finding its path, like wind following the contours of the landscape, like nature itself correcting an imbalance. There was no wasted motion, no excess force, no dramatic flourishes. Her hand rose to intercept Minji's attack with the simple inevitability of gravity, and when contact was made, it wasn't with the sharp crack of collision, but with the soft control of redirection. Minji's hand was caught again, but this time was different. This time, Hana didn't immediately let go. This time, she allowed herself to demonstrate just a fraction of what years of training had given her. She stepped forward, not aggressively, not with the stomping advance of someone looking for a fight, but with the flowing movement of someone who understood that positioning was everything. Her step put her inside Minji's reach, in the space where leverage became meaningless and superior technique began to dominate. "I asked you to stop," Hana said quietly, her voice carrying perfectly through the silent hallway despite its softness. "I tried to walk away. I apologized for defending myself." Minji struggled against the grip, but it was like trying to break free from flowing water, impossible to gain purchase on, impossible to overcome through brute force. For the first time in her life, her physical advantages meant nothing. Her height, her reach, her aggressive confidence, all of it was neutralized by technique so pure it looked effortless. "Let go of me," Minji demanded. But there was something new in her voice now, something that sent ripples of shock through the watching crowd. Fear. Minji Park, the untouchable queen of Seojin High, was afraid. "I will," Hana replied with the same gentle firmness she might use to calm a frightened animal. "When you promise that this ends here, when you give me your word that you'll leave me alone." The crowd pressed closer, but their energy had changed completely. The bloodthirsty anticipation had been replaced by something far more complex: awe, confusion, and a growing realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Because this wasn't a fight in any conventional sense. This was a demonstration of control so complete that it redefined their understanding of what power looked like. But Minji had never learned how to back down, had never developed the wisdom to recognize when she was completely outmatched. Pride and panic warred in her expression as she made one last desperate attempt to reassert her dominance. She swung her free hand toward Hana's face, putting everything she had into the attack, every ounce of fury and desperation and wounded ego, driving her fist forward with the kind of reckless abandon that comes from someone who would rather be hurt than humiliated. What happened next unfolded in slow motion for everyone watching, each movement crystal clear and impossible to misunderstand. Hana's free hand rose to meet the incoming attack, but instead of blocking it with force, she caught Minji's wrist with the same flowing precision she had demonstrated before. Now she held both of Minji's hands, controlling her completely while barely seeming to exert any effort at all. But that wasn't the moment that redefined everything. The moment came when Yuna, loyal soldier in Minji's army of cruelty, decided to join the attack. She rushed forward from the side, clearly intending to help her queen by blindsiding the girl who had dared to challenge their social order. Hana saw her coming. Of course, she saw her coming. Years of training had given her peripheral vision that missed nothing, situational awareness that accounted for every potential threat in a room. She could have stopped Yuna the same way she had stopped Minji, could have controlled the situation with the same gentle firmness. Instead, she did something that left the entire hallway speechless. Without releasing her hold on Minji, without even looking directly at Yuna, Hana shifted her weight and extended her leg in a movement that was part dance, part martial art, and part pure poetry. Her foot connected with Yuna's charging form, not with the devastating impact of a kick designed to hurt, but with the precise redirection of someone who understood leverage and momentum better than physics professors. Yuna found herself gently but irresistibly guided away from the confrontation. Her charge redirected into a harmless stumble that left her sitting on the floor, completely unharmed, but utterly bewildered. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop buzzing, because everyone in that hallway had just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. They had seen a girl simultaneously control two attackers while using no more force than necessary to neutralize the threat. They had watched someone demonstrate the kind of skill that belonged in movies, not in the corridors of their high school. Sora, the third member of Minji's inner circle, took one look at what had just happened and made the wisest decision of her academic career. She took several large steps backward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender, her eyes wide with the kind of respect that comes from finally understanding exactly how outclassed you are. Hana looked around the circle of faces surrounding her, some shocked, some amazed, some recording everything on their phones with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for once-in-a-lifetime events. And in that moment, she made another choice that would define how this story would be remembered. She smiled, not with arrogance or superiority, not with the cruel satisfaction of someone who had just demonstrated their dominance. She smiled with the gentle warmth of someone who had finally been allowed to show who she really was. Someone who had been carrying a secret for so long that sharing it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. "My grandfather always told me," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "that true strength isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you choose not to do when you have the power to do anything." And with that, she gently released Minji's hands and stepped back, giving the defeated bully plenty of space to retreat with whatever dignity she had left. The aftermath of revelation is always more powerful than the revelation itself. In that hallway at Seojin High, as Hana Kim stood in the center of a circle of stunned faces, the true impact of what had just happened began to ripple outward like shockwaves from an earthquake's epicenter. Minji stood frozen, her hands still raised in the positions where Hana had held them, staring at her former victim with an expression that cycled through disbelief, humiliation, and something that might have been awe if her ego could have allowed such a thing. Her carefully constructed image of invincibility had been shattered in a matter of seconds, and everyone had witnessed it. "That's impossible," she whispered, but the words came out cracked and hollow. Because it wasn't impossible. It had just happened. It had happened with such fluid grace that it looked almost choreographed, like a dance where only one person knew the steps. Yuna pulled herself up from the floor, brushing dust from her uniform with hands that shook slightly. She looked at Hana with new eyes, not the dismissive gaze of someone looking at prey, but the careful assessment of someone trying to understand exactly what they had just encountered. "How did you—" she started, then stopped, unable to finish the question because she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The crowd began to murmur, voices overlapping in a symphony of confusion and amazement. Phone cameras were still recording, but now they were capturing something entirely different than what their owners had expected. Instead of documenting another humiliation, they were preserving a moment that would fundamentally change how power was understood at their school. Did she just— that was like something out of a movie. Where did she learn to do that? I thought she was just the quiet girl. But through all the whispers and gasps and shocked exclamations, Hana remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, like the eye of a hurricane while chaos swirled around her. Her breathing was even, her posture relaxed, her expression peaceful in a way that seemed almost surreal, given what had just transpired. This was the moment when everyone realized that everything they thought they knew about Hana Kim had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, not misunderstood, completely, fundamentally, impossibly wrong. Minji's voice was barely audible, her usual commanding tone reduced to a whisper. "You're not who I thought you were." Hana tilted her head slightly, considering the statement with the kind of thoughtful attention she gave to everything. "I'm exactly who I've always been," she replied gently. "You just never asked." The simplicity of that statement hit the crowd like a physical blow. Because it was true, wasn't it? How many of them had ever actually tried to know Hana Kim? How many had looked beyond the surface, beyond the quiet demeanor and downcast eyes, to see the person underneath? A boy near the back of the crowd, Jun, who sat behind Hana in history class, suddenly spoke up. "I remember now," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "First day of freshman year, when they had us fill out those information sheets. Under hobbies, she wrote martial arts, but nobody believed it." All eyes turned to Hana, and she nodded with a small smile that held no trace of superiority, only a kind of gentle acknowledgement. "I've been training since I was 5 years old," she said simply. "My grandfather is Master Kim Jin-woo. Some of you might know the dojo on Hannam Street." A ripple of recognition went through the crowd. Master Kim's dojo was legendary in their neighborhood. Not famous in a flashy way, but respected in the quiet manner of institutions that had earned their reputation through decades of excellence. Several students suddenly remembered seeing the small, unassuming building, the aged wooden sign, the sense of something profound and traditional existing in the middle of their modern world. "That's why you never fought back," another voice said from the crowd. A girl named Somin, who had witnessed countless confrontations but never understood Hana's responses. "It wasn't because you couldn't. It was because you chose not to." "Every day," Hana confirmed, and in those 2 words was a lifetime of restraint, 1,000 moments of choosing peace over power, kindness over dominance. "Every single day I chose to walk away, to absorb the anger instead of reflecting it back, to be the gentle rain instead of the storm." Minji's face went through a series of transformations as the full weight of this revelation settled on her. She had built her identity around being the apex predator in their school's social ecosystem, but now she was discovering that she had been trying to intimidate someone who could have ended any of their confrontations in seconds, someone who had been protecting her all along. "You could have stopped me any time," she whispered, and there was something almost like wonder in her voice. "All those times, all those months, you could have made me look like a fool." "Why would I want to do that?" Hana asked, and the genuine confusion in her voice was perhaps the most devastating response she could have given, because it revealed not just her skill, but her character. It showed that the thought of humiliating others, of using her abilities to hurt or embarrass, was so foreign to her nature that she couldn't even understand why someone would want such a thing. The hallway had gone completely silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the hungry anticipation of a crowd waiting for violence. It was the profound quiet that follows a revelation so complete that it requires time to process. And then something beautiful happened. Slowly, hesitantly, a few students began to approach, not to challenge or confront, but to simply stand closer to someone they were finally seeing clearly for the first time. A girl from Hannah's chemistry class stepped forward first, followed by two boys from the soccer team, then more students from different grades, different social circles, different hierarchies within the school's complex social structure. They weren't approaching Hannah as fans or followers. They were approaching her as people who had just witnessed something that challenged every assumption they had about strength, about power, about what it meant to be truly formidable. "I'm sorry," came a voice from the crowd. Then another, "I'm sorry too." And another, "We should have seen." The apologies began to multiply. Students who had watched Hannah's humiliation in silence finally finding their voices, finally understanding that their inaction had made them complicit in tormenting someone who had shown them nothing but restraint and grace. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Yuna, still brushing dust from her uniform, looked directly at Hannah and said, "I don't understand. Why didn't you ever show us? Why did you let us treat you like what?" Hannah asked gently. "Like you were weak." Hannah considered this for a long moment, her expression thoughtful in the way of someone who had learned to think deeply about difficult questions. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of wisdom earned through years of discipline and reflection. "Because strength isn't about what others see," she said. "It's about what you know about yourself. And I've always known who I am." She looked around the circle of faces, some ashamed, some amazed, some still struggling to process what they had witnessed. "My grandfather taught me that the warrior's greatest victory is the battle that never happens. For months, every day that ended without violence was a victory. Every time I chose patience over pride, I won something more valuable than any fight could give me. But today," Somin said, still trying to understand, "today you chose to fight." "No," Hannah replied with a slight shake of her head. "Today I chose to protect. There's a difference." The distinction hit everyone like a revelation within a revelation, because she was right. What they had witnessed wasn't aggression or retaliation. It had been pure defense, control without cruelty, power without punishment. She had neutralized threats without causing harm, had demonstrated complete dominance while showing complete mercy. This was what mastery looked like. Not the flashy violence of movies or the dramatic showboating of competitive sports, but the quiet confidence of someone so skilled that she could control any situation without anyone getting hurt. As the implications of this settled over the crowd, as students began to truly understand what they had been witnessing all along, one last transformation began to take place. It started with whispered conversations, with students looking at Hannah with new respect, new understanding, but it crystallized when someone in the crowd began to clap. Slowly others joined in until the entire hallway was filled with applause, not the mocking, slow clap of sarcasm, but genuine appreciation for something extraordinary they had been privileged to witness. Hannah looked surprised by the response, her cheeks coloring slightly as she realized that for the first time in her academic career, she was the center of positive attention. And in that moment, watching her humble reaction to their applause, everyone understood that this was why she had hidden her abilities for so long. She truly didn't need their validation. She had never been seeking their approval or respect. She had simply been trying to exist peacefully in a world that often mistook kindness for weakness. But now that secret was out, and everything at Seojin High was about to change forever. 3 weeks later, the hallways of Seojin High looked the same, but felt completely different. The same fluorescent lights cast the same harsh illumination over the same polished floors, but the energy that flowed through those corridors had been fundamentally transformed by what everyone had come to call the incident. Hana Kim still walked with quiet grace, still carried her books close to her chest, still preferred listening to speaking. But now, when she moved through the hallways, something had changed in the way people looked at her. Not with the dismissive glances of before, not with the predatory calculation of bullies seeking prey, but with something far more powerful, genuine respect. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Change never does, especially the kind of deep, meaningful change that alters the very foundation of how people think about themselves and others. But it had happened steadily, rippling outward from that moment of revelation, like concentric circles spreading across a still pond. Minji Park had returned to school after a 3-day absence, during which the video of her humiliation had spread through social media with the viral intensity of content that perfectly captures a universal truth. But instead of the cruel mockery that usually accompanied such public defeats, the comments had been surprisingly thoughtful. This is what real strength looks like. Imagine having that much power and using it only to protect yourself. She could have destroyed them, but chose mercy instead. This girl is the definition of grace under pressure. When Minji finally returned, she was different. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by something more subdued but also more genuine. She avoided Hana at first, clearly struggling with how to navigate a world where her former victim had been revealed as someone who could have ended their conflicts any time, but had chosen not to. It was Hana who finally approached her, of course, because that's who Hana was. Someone who understood that true resolution required facing difficult conversations, not avoiding them. The encounter happened in the same hallway where everything had changed, during the quiet period between classes when most students were in their rooms. Minji was at her locker, moving with none of her usual theatrical confidence, when Hana appeared beside her like a gentle breeze. "Hi," Hana said simply. Minji's shoulders tensed, but she didn't run. Instead, she turned to face the girl she had tormented for months, the girl who had shown her what real power looked like. "I don't know what to say to you," Minji admitted, her voice stripped of all its usual venom. "I don't know how to... after everything I did." "You don't have to say anything," Hana replied with the same gentle patience she had always shown. "But if you want to, I'm listening." And in that simple offer of grace, not forgiveness forced or demanded, but the space for Minji to find her own path to redemption, something beautiful began to grow. The conversation that followed was quiet, honest, and transformative. Minji spoke about her own insecurities, about the pressure to maintain dominance, about the fear that had driven her to hurt others before they could hurt her. Hana listened without judgment, offering insights drawn from years of training that emphasized discipline over aggression, inner strength over outward displays of power. When it was over, they weren't friends. That kind of relationship takes time to build and requires trust earned through consistent action. But they were no longer enemies. They were two people who had finally seen each other clearly, without the distortions of fear and projection that had defined their previous interactions. The change in their dynamic sent shockwaves through the school's social structure. If Minji Park could be humbled and transformed, if she could learn to treat others with respect instead of cruelty, then perhaps change was possible for everyone. Students who had participated in bullying through action or inaction began to examine their own behavior. Teachers noticed a shift in classroom dynamics, a reduction in the casual cruelty that had previously been accepted as normal teenage behavior. Parents received fewer calls about conflicts and disciplinary issues. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in how students understood strength itself. Before the incident, strength had been defined by dominance. who could hurt others, who could intimidate effectively, who could maintain control through fear. But Hana's demonstration had revealed a completely different paradigm, one where strength was measured by restraint, where power was defined by the choice not to use it, where true mastery meant controlling situations without causing harm. The dojo on Hannam Street, which had operated quietly for decades, serving a small but dedicated community, suddenly found itself with a waiting list of prospective students. Young people who had witnessed Hana's grace under pressure wanted to learn not just the physical techniques, but the mental discipline that made such control possible. Master Kim Jin-woo, Hana's grandfather, found himself in the unexpected position of having to turn away students for the first time in his teaching career. But he was selective, accepting only those who demonstrated genuine interest in the philosophical aspects of martial arts, not just the physical skills. "My granddaughter," he told new students during their orientation, "has shown you what happens when technique serves character, when skill is guided by wisdom. If you want to learn to fight, there are many schools that will teach you. If you want to learn to be strong without needing to prove it, then you may stay." The ripple effects continued to spread beyond the school, beyond the neighborhood, beyond anything anyone could have predicted. The video of Hana's response to bullying became a case study in conflict resolution programs. Child psychologists used it to illustrate the difference between aggression and assertiveness. Martial arts instructors around the world shared it as an example of their art's true purpose. But for Hana herself, the most meaningful change was simpler and more personal. For the first time in her academic career, she could walk through the hallways without constantly calculating escape routes or de-escalation strategies. She could focus on her studies, on her friendships, on the normal concerns of a teenager whose extraordinary abilities no longer needed to be hidden. She still trained every morning with her grandfather, still found peace in the flowing movements of kata, still drew strength from the ancient wisdom that had shaped her character. But now, those morning sessions felt different, not like preparation for enduring another day of conflict, but like communion with something beautiful and timeless that connected her to generations of students who had walked the same path. And sometimes, when the morning light filtered through the dojo windows in just the right way, she would catch her grandfather watching her with an expression of profound pride. Not because she had won a fight or demonstrated superior technique, but because she had remained true to her principles, even when doing so required tremendous courage. "Your grandmother would be proud," he told her one morning after a particularly graceful kata. "She always said that the greatest battles are fought not with fists, but with character. You proved that in front of everyone." Standing there in the dojo, where she had learned not just to fight, but to be strong, Hana felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. She had faced her greatest test not when Minji's hand came toward her face, but in every moment she had chosen restraint over retaliation, patience over pride, mercy over vengeance. Because here's what Hana Kim understood. What her grandfather had spent years teaching her, what that hallway full of students had finally witnessed, true strength isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you choose not to do when you have the power to do anything. If you've ever felt like Hana, if you've ever had to hide your true capabilities to keep the peace, if you've ever chosen kindness in the face of cruelty, if you've ever wondered whether showing restraint makes you weak instead of strong, then you understand the choice she faced every single day. Sometimes the world mistakes gentleness for helplessness, patience for cowardice, mercy for weakness. But as Hana proved in that hallway at Seojin High, sometimes the quiet ones are quiet because they're the only ones who truly understand the weight of their own power. Have you ever had to make that choice? Have you ever held back when you could have devastated someone, chosen to absorb pain rather than reflect it back? Your story matters too. Your restraint has value. Your choice of peace over pride makes you stronger than you know. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful thing you can do is remain true to who you are, even when the world is trying to force you to become someone else. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own hidden strength, then share it. Share it with someone who needs to remember that sometimes the gentlest hearts carry the fiercest spirits. After all, we never know who around us is fighting their own daily battle between showing their power and choosing their peace. And sometimes, just sometimes, they need to be reminded that choosing peace doesn't make them weak. It makes them warriors of the highest order.